What if I told you that one of the greatest and most brilliant armies in history was destroyed not by the strength of its enemy, but by its own unbearable arrogance? At the end of the 14th century, European knighthood seemed to have reached the peak of its power, becoming an indestructible force clad in shining steel. But this shining armor, a symbol of honor, wealth, and glory, soon turned into a deadly trap for its owners. Confident in their invincibility, knights went into battle as centuries of tradition had taught them, proudly, head-on, not believing that a simple foot soldier could challenge them. However, the world had changed. New weapons, new tactics, and a completely different view of war appeared on the battlefields. This new force, organized troops armed with bows, spears, and iron patience, saw no honor in combat, only a task to be accomplished. And where knights fought for glory, their opponents fought for results. It was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of eras. The old world, which lived by a code, and the new, where reason prevailed over heroism. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single insane attack by French knights led to the death of Europe's best warriors, becoming a lesson for all future generations and a symbol of the end of the golden age of chivalry. I will reveal to you a secret that is rarely discussed in textbooks. By the end of the 14th century, Europe was not just frightened, it was on the verge of panic. The reason for this was the Ottoman Empire, a young and incredibly aggressive state that was expanding at an alarming rate. Led by their Sultan, Bayezid I, nicknamed the Thunderbolt for the speed of his military campaigns, the Ottomans were swallowing up one Balkan territory after another. Their expansion was not just a series of raids, it was a methodical conquest and establishment of a new order. Every year, Turkish troops advanced further west, threatening not only the Orthodox states of the Balkans, but also the very heart of the Christian world. Serbia had already been forced to recognize vassalage, and Bulgaria had practically ceased to exist as an independent state. The once great Byzantine Empire had shrunk to the size of Constantinople and its surroundings, becoming a shadow of its former self. Desperately begging for help, European monarchs ignored this threat for a long time, preoccupied with their own endless wars and civil strife, primarily the 100 Years' War between England and France. However, by the 1390s, it became impossible to ignore Ottoman expansion. Bayezid the Thunderbolt made no secret of his ambitions, and his gaze was fixed on Hungary, which was considered the last bastion of the Catholic world in the East. The Hungarian king, Sigismund of Luxembourg, sounded the alarm, sending messengers to all the European courts. He called for a united crusade to stop the infidels before it was too late. He painted pictures of burned villages and enslaved peoples in an attempt to appeal to the conscience of his Western allies. His appeal was not just a request for help, it was a warning of impending disaster. Pope Boniface IX supported this initiative, seeing it not only as a way to stop the Ottomans, but also as an opportunity to reunite the Christian world under his leadership. He announced a new crusade, offering indulgences and forgiveness of sins to all who took up arms to defend the faith. This appeal found the most enthusiastic response where it was perhaps least expected, in France. The French knights, weary of the temporary lull in the 100 Years' War, seized upon this idea with incredible enthusiasm. For them, it was a chance to gain glory, fulfill their Christian duty, and, not least, take part in a great adventure. They imagined this campaign as a triumphal march rather than a grueling military campaign. Young French aristocrats such as Jean, Count of Nevers, son of the powerful Duke of Burgundy, invested entire fortunes in preparations. They ordered the best armor, had luxurious garments made, and assembled huge retinues. It was not just an army, it was an army of vanity, a competition to see who looked richer and more influential. They were joined by knights from England, Germany, Italy, and other European countries. A huge multinational force was assembled, which contemporaries called the most brilliant army the Christian world had ever seen. They were absolutely confident of their invincibility, considering the Ottomans to be nothing more than a wild horde that would scatter at the mere sight of their shining armor. This blind self-confidence became their first enemy. They did not bother to study their opponent, his tactics, his strengths. They were not going to fight, but to march triumphantly through enemy territory, bringing the light of Christianity. They brought with them luxurious tents, cooks, and musicians, but neglected siege engines and discipline. Sigismund of Hungary, who was supposed to be the nominal leader of the campaign, watched this carelessness with horror. He knew who they were up against, having already fought the Turks and knowing their strength. But his cautious advice and calls for discipline were drowned out by the general chorus of boasting and arrogance of the French knights, who considered themselves the main force of the campaign. Do you think this self-confidence was justified? Or did it lead to disaster from the very beginning? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Want to know the secret that predetermined the outcome of the battle before it even began? It lies in the very composition of the so-called Crusader army. It was not a unified force, but a patchwork quilt of conflicting ambitions, national prejudices, and a complete lack of unified command. Each unit obeyed only its own feudal lord, and there was no overall strategy as a class. The heart of the army, its financial and ideological center, was the French contingent. About 10,000 elite warriors, including more than 1,000 knights, represented the cream of the French aristocracy. They were led by the 24-year-old Jean, Count of Nevers, who went down in history as Jean the Fearless. However, he earned this nickname not for his wisdom, but for his reckless bravery and complete disregard for danger. The French arrived in Buda with such pomp that they dazzled the Hungarian court. Their armor was encrusted with gold, their banners were made of pure silk, and their retinues numbered hundreds of servants. They behaved not as allies, but as masters of the situation, openly mocking the Hungarians and their more pragmatic approach to war. They believed that their glory alone could win the war. Alongside them were the forces of Sigismund of Hungary, more organized and disciplined, but less impressive. The Hungarians, Germans, Czechs, and Croats who made up his army already had experience fighting the Ottomans. They knew that this was not a knightly tournament, but a brutal war for survival. Sigismund was an experienced politician and commander, but his authority was constantly undermined by French arrogance. The Knights Hospitaller from Rhodes, one of the few who truly understood the essence of the Ottoman threat, also joined the campaign. They were joined by troops from England, led by the famous John Beaufort, as well as warriors from Italy, Spain, and Wallachia. On paper, it was a formidable force, one of the largest Christian armies ever assembled in the East. However, from the very beginning, the campaign turned into a demonstration of French arrogance. The French demanded that their vanguard lead the army, considering it their honorary right. They rejected all attempts by Sigismund to establish uniform discipline and develop a common strategy. Their motto was, "If the sky falls, we will support it with the tips of our spears." The march down the Danube turned into something between a military parade and a marauding raid. The Crusaders marched slowly, holding lavish feasts and nightly tournaments at every halt. Discipline fell to an all-time low. Instead of preparing to face a formidable enemy, the French knights competed in luxury and boasting. The first military clashes only reinforced their belief in their own invincibility. They captured several small Ottoman fortresses, such as Vidin and Oryahovo. These successes, achieved against small garrisons, were inflated to the scale of great victories. The French celebrated, completely unaware that the main forces of the enemy had not even appeared yet. Sigismund tried in vain to call them to order. He pointed out that their slow advance was giving Bayezid time to gather his forces, and that their cruelty toward the local population was turning even Christians against them. But his words were ignored. The French marshals replied that they knew better how to wage war. The culmination of this parade of arrogance was the siege of Nicopolis. It was a strong Ottoman fortress on the Danube, which the Crusaders decided to take along the way. They approached the walls confident that the garrison would immediately surrender at the sight of their banners. However, the commandant of the fortress, the experienced warrior Dogan Bey, flatly refused to surrender. What could such a blatant underestimation of the enemy lead to? In the next chapter, you will learn how the Ottoman Sultan prepared a shocking surprise for them. What happened next defies all notions of medieval military science. Instead of immediately storming the fortress or beginning a systematic siege, the Crusaders turned their camp near Nicopolis into another place for celebrations. They were so confident of victory that they saw no point in rushing. The problem was that this brilliant army had virtually no siege equipment. They had brought with them neither catapults, trebuchets, nor siege towers. French knights considered engineering to be an occupation unworthy of a noble warrior. They seriously believed that they could take a powerful fortress by sight alone, or at worst, by storming it with ladders. Dogan Bey, the Ottoman commander, watched these attempts with a smirk. His garrison was well supplied and ready for a long defense. The walls of Nicopolis were strong, and the defenders were experienced warriors. They responded to the careless attacks of the Crusaders with accurate shots from bows and crossbows, quickly cooling the ardor of the attackers. The siege turned into a farce. Instead of digging trenches and building siege engines, the knights held feasts in full view of the fortress's defenders. They spent their days gambling, holding tournaments, and arguing about who would get the lion's share of the spoils after victory. Discipline in the camp was completely absent. Sigismund of Hungary was in despair. He understood that every day spent under the walls of Nicopolis worked against them. He knew what Bayezid the Thunderbolt was capable of and feared his sudden appearance. He repeatedly called on the French to take more active and meaningful action, but they just waved him off. French Marshal Boucicaut, one of the most famous knights of his time, declared that they would wait until the fortress died of hunger. This was an absurd statement, considering that the besiegers themselves could soon run into problems with provisions. Their huge army required a colossal amount of supplies. Meanwhile, Ottoman foragers and light cavalry operating in the surrounding area began to harass the Crusader camp. They intercepted supply trains, attacked small detachments, and kept the army in a state of constant tension. But even this did not sober up the French command. Moreover, rumors reached the Crusaders that Bayezid was far away, possibly in Asia, or still busy with the siege of Constantinople. These rumors, which may have been deliberate disinformation, finally lulled them into a false sense of security. They believed that the Sultan would not have time to come to the aid of the garrison. They were wrong. While the knights were feasting and boasting, Bayezid, having received news of the siege of Nicopolis, did the unthinkable. He withdrew his army from the siege of Constantinople and led it on a forced march north. It was a march that went down in the annals of military history. The Crusaders' camp was so carefree that their intelligence completely failed. They did not know that the enemy was already close. They continued their games and arguments, confident that the Sultan was still hundreds of kilometers away from them. This blind faith in their own superiority was the main reason for their impending doom. This carelessness is striking. If you appreciate analysis based on facts rather than myths, please like this video. What if I told you that everything European knights were taught was useless against Bayezid's tactics? The Sultan was not given the nickname Lightning for his beautiful eyes. He was a master of quick and unexpected maneuvers. Upon learning of the Crusaders' campaign, he did not wait for them in the capital, but immediately set out to meet them, gathering all available forces. While the Crusaders slowly crawled along the Danube, spending weeks feasting and capturing small fortresses, Bayezid took action. His army, consisting of professional battle-hardened warriors, moved at a speed that was incredible for that time. He did not have thousands of servants and cumbersome supply trains that would slow down the movement. The Ottoman army was a completely different organism from the feudal militia of the Crusaders. At its core were the Janissaries, an elite infantry loyal to the Sultan himself. In addition to them, there were the Sipahis, heavy cavalry, as well as numerous auxiliary troops, including the light cavalry Akinji, ideal for reconnaissance and guerrilla warfare. This army was bound together by iron discipline and obeyed a single will, the will of the Sultan. Bayezid was not just a monarch, he was a true commander who shared all the hardships of the campaign with his soldiers. He knew exactly the strengths and weaknesses of his troops and knew how to use them. The forced march from Constantinople to Nicopolis was a masterpiece of military logistics. In a remarkably short time, the Ottoman army covered a huge distance and reached the Danube River. The Crusaders, who were camped carelessly, were stunned when their scouts finally reported the appearance of the Sultan's vanguard. The first reaction in the Crusader camp was disbelief. The French knights could not believe that Bayezid dared to challenge them so quickly. Some even suggested that this was only a small advance guard, not the main force. However, it soon became clear that this was the entire Ottoman army, ready for a general battle. Bayezid's appearance instantly put an end to all feasting and tournaments. The siege of Nicopolis was immediately lifted. The Crusaders hastily left their camp and began to line up in battle formation on the plain south of the city. At last, they had what they had so desired, a great and glorious battle. Bayezid, for his part, did not attack immediately. He took up an advantageous position on the hills, allowing his troops to rest after their march. He also managed to prepare the battlefield. On his orders, thousands of sharpened stakes were driven into the ground on the slope where the knights were to attack, hidden in the grass. The Sultan understood perfectly well who he was dealing with. He knew about the reckless bravery and tactical straightforwardness of the French knights. He had no doubt that they would rush into a frontal attack without bothering to conduct reconnaissance, and he prepared a deadly trap for them. On the evening before the battle, a fateful military council was held in the Crusaders' camp. Now that the enemy was before them, a unified plan of action had to be worked out, and it was at this council that French arrogance manifested itself in all its tragic glory. Now that battle was inevitable. Who would propose the best plan? In the next chapter, you will learn about the fateful council that decided the fate of the army. That night, all the key leaders of the crusade gathered in the tent of the Hungarian king Sigismund. The atmosphere was tense. The confidence and boasting of the previous weeks had given way to feverish excitement before the inevitable battle. At stake was not just victory, but the fate of the entire campaign and possibly Eastern Europe. Sigismund, as the nominal commander-in-chief and a man with real experience of war with the Ottomans, was the first to speak. He proposed a plan based on his knowledge of the enemy's tactics. His strategy was cautious, well thought out, and relied on the interaction of different branches of the army, which was very rare for feudal armies. Sigismund's plan was simple and logical. He knew that Bayezid always put his light, irregular infantry and cavalry, the akinji, at the front. These troops were intended to take the first blow, wear down the enemy, disrupt their ranks, and then retreat under the protection of the main forces. Therefore, the Hungarian king proposed to put his infantry and Wallachian allies in the front line. These warriors were not as well armored as the French knights, but they were experienced in fighting the Turks. They were to withstand the first attack, and then, when the Ottoman vanguard was exhausted and its ranks mixed, the main forces would enter the fray. Sigismund insisted that the French knights, as the most powerful and heavy-striking force of the army, should remain in reserve. They were to enter the battle in the second phase, fresh and full of strength. Their task was to deliver a decisive blow to the Sultan's already tired and disorganized elite units, the Janissaries and Sipahis. It was a sensible tactic. It exploited the strengths of each contingent, the resilience of the Hungarian infantry, and the striking power of the French heavy cavalry. Sigismund's plan deprived Bayezid of his main tactical advantage, the ability to wear down the enemy in small skirmishes before the decisive blow. Moreover, Sigismund warned the French about possible traps. He said that the Ottomans were masters of ambushes and that they could use feigned retreats to lure the knights into an attack. He implored them to act cautiously and not to succumb to provocation. Unfortunately, this sensible and pragmatic plan was taken as a personal insult by the French command. For knights raised in the traditions of courtly warfare, the idea of hiding behind the backs of poorly armed infantry was unthinkable. They believed that the place of honor in the vanguard belonged to them by right. French Marshal Boucicaut and Constable Philippe d'Artois, Count d'Aix, immediately raised fierce objections. They accused Sigismund of cowardice. They claimed that the Hungarian king simply wanted to steal their glory of victory. The dispute flared up with renewed vigor, and there was no longer any room for logic or military strategy. It was a conflict of mentalities. For the French, the battle was a continuation of the tournament, a place where they could show personal valor and gain glory. For Sigismund, it was a war for survival. Jean, Count of Nevers, the young and ambitious leader of the French, succumbed to pressure from his more experienced but less intelligent comrades. He supported the demand to attack immediately, and specifically with French knights. He did not want anyone else to receive the laurels of Bayezid's defeat.
The northern pass
Are you ready for the shocking truth about how one decision made out of pride can destroy an entire army? That is exactly what happened at the Crusaders' Council of War. The French demand to lead the attack was not just a tactical dispute, it was an ultimatum. They declared that if they were not given the honor of striking the first blow, they would not participate in the battle at all. Philippe d'Artois, Constable of France, angrily uttered a phrase that proved fatal. To hide knights behind infantry is to deprive them of their honor. We will go ahead and let those who are afraid follow us. This was a direct attack on Sigismund and his Hungarian warriors. The atmosphere became extremely tense. The oldest and one of the most respected warriors of France, Admiral Jean de Vienne, intervened in the dispute. He was a veteran of many campaigns and the bearer of France's sacred banner, the Oran. He tried to appeal to the young knight's prudence by supporting Sigismund's plan. He said that the Hungarian king's experience in battles with the Turks was invaluable and that pride should not blind them. However, his voice was drowned out by the general noise. The young aristocrats, thirsty for glory, booed the veteran. They declared that the brave French did not need the advice of cautious old men. They were confident that their heavy cavalry would wipe the Turkish dogs off the battlefield in one fell swoop. Sigismund of Hungary, seeing that his army was divided and on the verge of open rebellion even before the battle began, was forced to concede. With a heavy heart, he agreed to the French plan. He knew it was crazy, but he had no choice. He only asked that after the French attack, they wait for Hungarian reinforcements. The French took his concession for granted, as recognition of their superiority. They spent the rest of the night celebrating and boasting, anticipating an easy victory. They did not even bother to conduct a full reconnaissance of the area they were about to attack. On the morning of September 25th, 1396, the French contingent lined up in the vanguard. It was a truly magnificent sight. Thousands of knights in shining armor, with plumes on their helmets and family crests on their shields. Their war horses, also protected by armor, stamped their hooves impatiently. Behind them were the rest of the Crusader forces. Hungarians, Germans, Hospitallers, and Wallisians under the command of Sigismund. Their plan was to support the French attack as soon as it succeeded. They were ready to join the battle, but they were ordered to wait. Bayezid's army awaited them on the opposite hill. The Ottoman Sultan had positioned his troops with brilliant foresight. He placed the irregular ikinci troops in front, followed by rows of infantry, and behind the infantry was the forest of sharpened stakes, hidden from the eyes of the attackers. Bayezid kept his elite units, the Janissaries and the Sipahi cavalry, in reserve at the top of the hill close to him. He also placed Serbian vassals under the command of Stefan Lazarevich on the flanks, who were to strike at the decisive moment. The Sultan's plan was the complete opposite of the Crusaders' plan. Flexible, multi-layered, and designed to exploit the enemy's mistakes. What would this insane attack lead to? In the next chapter, we will see how knightly valor collided with cold military reality. With the first rays of the sun, the sound of hundreds of battle horns rang out. Without waiting for the general order from Sigismund, the French knights lowered their visors and spurred their horses. The great attack, so eagerly awaited by the cream of European knighthood, had begun. It was a living avalanche of steel rolling down one hill to crush the enemy on another. The spectacle was stunning. The earth shook under thousands of hooves. The sun reflected off the polished steel, blinding the enemy. The French charged with furious cries, confident that in a few minutes the battle would be won. They were the embodiment of medieval military power brought to its absolute. The first line of the Ottoman army, consisting of lightly armed infantry and ikinci cavalry, could not withstand this onslaught. These troops were not designed to stop a frontal attack by heavy cavalry. Their task was to wear down the enemy, shower them with arrows, and retreat. The French knights cut into their ranks like a giant steel wedge. The ikinci's defense was instantly broken. The irregular troops, following orders, began to retreat up the slope in feigned disorder. This tactical maneuver was interpreted by the French as the beginning of a panicked retreat by the entire Ottoman army. Euphoria swept over the attackers. They believed that victory was already in their hands. "The enemy is fleeing," spread through the ranks. Instead of stopping, regrouping, and assessing the situation, as Sigismund begged them to do, The knights only spurred their horses harder. They wanted to get to the Sultan and his treasures as quickly as possible. They chased the retreating Ottomans up the slope, not noticing that their own formation was breaking down. The heavy war horses began to tire from galloping over the rough terrain uphill. Intoxicated by their success, the knights ignored all signs of danger, eager to be the first to break into Bayezid's camp. More experienced warriors, such as Jean de Vienne, tried to restore order. They saw that the attack was becoming chaotic, that the knights were breaking away from each other, but their calls for caution were drowned out by the roar of battle and the cries of victory. The excitement of the chase completely took hold of the French army. They rushed forward, seeing nothing but the backs of the retreating enemy. They did not know that this slope was not just a battlefield, but a carefully prepared trap. Bayezid watched calmly from the top of the hill as the cream of European knighthood drove itself into a trap. The first stage of the battle seemed to have been completely won by the French. They crushed the enemy's vanguard and advanced triumphantly toward its center. But this was only the prologue to disaster. They broke through the first line of defense, unaware that the most terrible obstacle was still ahead. Sigismund's Hungarian army watched this mad dash with alarm. The king saw that the French had fallen for Bayezid's old trick. He immediately ordered his troops to move forward to support their allies. But it was too late. The French had gotten too far ahead. After crossing the first line and dispersing the irregular troops, the French knights reached the crest of the hill. They expected to see the Sultan's camp or his elite troops ready for battle. But instead, they saw something completely different and far more terrifying. A field strewn with thousands of sharpened stakes. Bayezid's trap worked perfectly. The stakes were driven into the ground at an angle and covered with grass, making them virtually invisible until the very last moment. For heavy cavalry charging full speed up the slope, it was an insurmountable obstacle. The first rows of knights flew into this field at full speed. Heavy war horses, unable to stop, stumbled upon sharp wooden spikes. Indescribable chaos ensued. The attack, which a moment ago seemed triumphant, was suddenly stifled. Horses and riders fell, creating obstacles that the next rows crashed into. The steel avalanche turned into a giant, disorderly pile of people and animals. The knights, thrown to the ground, found themselves in a deadly trap. Their magnificent but incredibly heavy armor, weighing dozens of kilograms, was now their curse. Once fallen, they could not get up quickly without help. They resembled overturned turtles floundering in mud and debris. Their spears were broken, their swords useless in such a mess. The few who managed to avoid the stakes or whose horses survived were completely confused. Their formation was broken, their attack halted. They were disoriented and did not understand what had happened. Euphoria gave way to horror and confusion. It was at this moment that Bayezid gave the order to counterattack. Fresh and perfectly disciplined regiments of janissaries emerged from behind the hill where they had been hiding. These were the Sultan's elite infantry, armed with bows, sabers, and yataghans. They went into battle not as a feudal militia, but as a modern professional army. The janissaries did not engage in knightly duels. They acted in a coordinated and methodical manner. They surrounded the dismounted and helpless French knights and began to systematically neutralize them. For a heavily armed but slow-moving knight, fighting against several agile and well-trained infantrymen was practically hopeless. The French vanguard ceased to exist as a combat unit. It turned into a crowd of desperately defending aristocrats, surrounded on all sides. Old Admiral Jean de Vienne, holding the French banner in his hands, fought to the last and fell in this melee, trying to gather the remnants of the knights around him. The catastrophe was complete. The entire striking power of the Crusader army was destroyed in a matter of minutes because of a single tactical error born of arrogance. But that was not the end of the battle. The main forces were entering the fray. While the cream of French knighthood was perishing in the trap on the hill, Sigismund of Hungary desperately tried to save the situation. He saw the disaster unfolding before his eyes. Realizing that the vanguard had been destroyed, he led his main forces, Hungarian, German, and other European knights and infantry, into the attack. This second attack was more organized. Sigismund and his warriors clashed with the same janissaries who were already busy neutralizing the French. A fierce battle ensued, and for a moment it seemed that the Crusaders still had a chance. The Hungarian cavalry and infantry fought desperately, trying to break through to the top of the hill. Their onslaught was so strong that the Janissaries, who had already suffered losses, began to retreat. Sigismund, fighting in the front ranks, encouraged his warriors. It seemed that the scales might tip in favor of the Christians. Bayezid, watching the battle, saw this danger. But unlike the Crusaders, the Sultan still had fresh reserves. At the moment when Sigismund's army was fully engaged in battle with the Janissaries, Bayezid gave his final order. He threw his elite heavy cavalry, the Sipahis, into battle, as well as his Serbian vassals under the command of Stefan Lazarevich. This was the decisive blow. The fresh, heavy cavalry of the Sipahis and Serbs struck the flank of Sigismund's army. The Christian warriors, already exhausted from the heavy battle with the Janissaries, could not withstand this simultaneous attack from the front and flank. Their formation was broken, and a panicked retreat began. The battle, which was already hanging by a thread, turned into a complete rout. The Crusader army fled. Soldiers and knights, throwing down their weapons, rushed to the Danube, where their ships were moored. Sigismund, surrounded by his bodyguards, struggled to reach the river. Seeing that all was lost, the king of Hungary got into a boat and crossed over to one of the ships. According to legend, looking at the battlefield littered with his soldiers, he said bitterly, "We lost this battle because of the pride and arrogance of these Frenchmen. If only they had listened to me, we would have had men to fight." The remnants of the army were either scattered or pushed back to the river. The Wallachian prince Mircea the Old, who had been skeptical of the French tactics from the outset, managed to withdraw his troops from the battlefield in an orderly manner, saving them from complete destruction. But for most of the Crusaders, the battle was over. Thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner, including the most distinguished aristocrats of France: John the Fearless, Count of Nevers, Marshal Boucicaut, Philip d'Artois. All of them ended up in the hands of the Sultan. The brilliant army, which had set out on its campaign with such pomp and circumstance just a few months earlier, ceased to exist. Bayezid the Thunderbolt won his greatest victory. He not only stopped the crusade, but also dealt European knighthood a defeat from which it would never recover. Nicopolis was not just a lost battle, it became a symbol of the end of an entire era. The consequences of the Battle of Nicopolis were catastrophic for the Christian world. This battle was not just another defeat, but a turning point that showed how fragile the unity of Europe was in the face of a new threat. The Christian army, which had gathered knights from all corners of the continent, was considered invincible. It was a symbol of the power, wealth, and faith of the Western world. However, a single clash with Bayezid's army dispelled this illusion. Nicopolis became a terrible reminder that pride and underestimating the enemy can lead even the strongest army to destruction. It was not just a military defeat, it was a moral and psychological blow from which Europe took decades to recover. The destruction of the united army left not only the Balkans defenseless, but also the very idea of the Crusades as a means of defending Christianity. The news of the death of the best knights, the flower of the French and Burgundian nobility, shook the hearts of their contemporaries. People realized that the power of weapons and noble birth no longer guaranteed victory. The world was changing, and with it, old ideas about the infallibility of knighthood were crumbling. After Nicopolis, an era of doubt and fear of Ottoman power began. The most powerful and invincible army that united Europe could field was destroyed in a single battle. Its defeat was incomprehensible to the people of that time. French and German chroniclers wrote about Nicopolis with horror, comparing it to the fall of the Roman Empire. Not only people died in this catastrophe, but also the very idea of Western superiority. The battle, conceived as a crusade against the infidels, ended in mass slaughter and disgrace. It became a symbol of the end of the era of romantic wars and the beginning of pragmatic, brutal campaigns, where strategy, not honor, was the deciding factor. The fate of the prisoners varied and depended on their origin and nobility. After the battle, Bayezid walked around the field where thousands of dead lay and saw the price he had paid for victory. His own Janissaries and Sipahis suffered heavy losses, especially after the reckless attack by the French cavalry, which rushed in without orders. The Sultan's anger was terrible. He believed that the pride and arrogance of the Europeans should be punished in such a way that the whole West would remember this day. Therefore, he decided to turn the massacre into a lesson that would make everyone who dared to oppose him tremble. Bayezid, after examining the bodies of the dead and wounded, ordered all the noble knights and aristocrats to be separated. These prisoners were to be spared, as huge ransoms could be obtained for them. Among them were John of Nevers, son of the Duke of Burgundy, as well as dozens of commanders and representatives of noble families. Their lives were spared, but not out of mercy, but for profit. They were chained and sent to Turkish camps, where they spent long months in captivity, waiting for their families to collect the money. For the proud knights, captivity was a humiliation that they never forgot for the rest of their lives. The fate of ordinary soldiers, infantrymen, and squires was much worse. They were of no interest to the Sultan and could not be ransomed. An angry Bayezid ordered a public execution to intimidate Europe. The day after the battle, thousands of prisoners were taken out to the field and executed in front of the surviving aristocrats. Swords worked for hours until the entire valley was filled with bodies. This bloody spectacle was a message. No one would dare come to the east with a sword in the name of the cross again. Witnesses described how the aristocrats stood, unable to look away from what was happening. They understood that if they were less noble, the same fate would await them. Many of them lost their faith in the knightly code and the justice of war forever. Europe learned of the mass execution, and the news caused horror and shame. Nicopolis became not only a military defeat, but also a moral catastrophe, a symbol of retribution for pride. The chronicles describe this day as one of the darkest in the history of Christianity. News of the disaster reached Paris and other European capitals only a few months later. Messengers who made it to France brought with them terrible news and lists of the dead. The courts were plunged into mourning. Almost every noble family had lost someone on the distant banks of the Danube. Memorial services were held in churches, monks recorded the names of the dead in chronicles, and poets composed mournful ballads. Initial disbelief gave way to a realization of reality. Europe had lost its best warriors, and this was felt as a personal loss for the entire continent. Soon the search for those responsible began. French knights accused the Hungarians of cowardice, while the Hungarians accused the French of recklessness. Priests saw the defeat as God's punishment for the sins and pride of the nobility. But regardless of the explanations, the defeat at Nicopolis was a disgrace that could not be hidden. It undermined faith in the infallibility of knighthood and the authority of Western monarchs. From then on, the word crusade no longer evoked enthusiasm, but was associated with death and recklessness. A long and humiliating process of collecting ransom for the captured knights began. The prices demanded by the Sultan were enormous. The Duke of Burgundy, Jean de Nevers' father, was forced to sell land, treasures, and even mortgage cities to save his son. Taxes and donations were collected throughout France and Flanders, and the peasants grumbled, not understanding why they had to pay for someone else's adventures. These ransoms undermined the economies of entire regions, causing impoverishment and growing discontent among the common people. Even years later, the memory of this devastation lived on in people's minds. The captured knights returned to France only after many months, exhausted, weakened, and disgraced. No one greeted them with jubilation. They were not heroes, but a reminder of shame. Jean Neversky, who had dreamed of glory and a cross on his chest, returned with debts and the shadow of tragedy in his eyes. But it was this ordeal that tempered his character. Later, under the name John the Fearless, he became one of the most influential men in France. A man who had learned not to fear defeat because he had already experienced the worst. For Hungary, the defeat at Nicopolis was a real disaster. The country, which had hoped for help from Europe, was left alone with the Ottomans. Sigismund, king of Hungary, barely escaped by fleeing along the Danube, and many considered it a miracle that he survived. He returned to Budapest not as a victor, but as a man who had to rebuild the defenses. Hopes for quick help from the West were dashed. For decades, Hungary became Europe's frontline fortress against the Muslim East. The Balkans found themselves in an even more difficult position. After Nicopolis, the Ottomans easily subjugated Bulgaria, Serbia, and Wallachia. Christian fortresses fell one after another. Local princes were forced to either pay tribute or seek refuge in the mountains. Constantinople, deprived of allies, found itself besieged by fate. This defeat marked the beginning of the final decades of the Byzantine Empire. Nicopolis became one of the stepping stones on the Ottomans' path to the Bosphorus. In a military sense, Nicopolis became a watershed. It showed that the era of knightly armies based on personal bravery and pride was coming to an end. The battle clearly demonstrated that shiny armor and heroism cannot replace discipline and competent leadership. European military leaders had to rethink their methods of training troops. Feudal militias were replaced by regular armies, where command was subject to a unified plan rather than the impulses of noblemen. This lesson was harsh but necessary. The Battle of Nicopolis was the last great crusade of the Middle Ages. It ended an entire era when knights believed that faith in the sword could change the world. It was now clear that war required not only courage, but also intelligence. Nicopolis became the swan song of knighthood, a farewell to the era of valiant but overconfident warriors. French pride, Hungarian haste, and a general lack of unity destroyed an army that could have become the shield of Europe. Instead of glory, there was only defeat, shame, and the Ottomans' path to the very heart of the continent. The Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 went down in history not just as another battle, but as a painful lesson that Europe was forced to learn. It was a brutal clash between two worlds, the fading era of medieval chivalry with its cult of personal glory and the emerging era of centralized, disciplined armies. We see how arrogance, lack of unified command, and complete disregard for the enemy led one of the most brilliant armies of its time to complete and humiliating defeat. The French knights, who considered themselves invincible, found themselves helpless in the face of Bayezid's pragmatic tactics, his traps, and his iron discipline. This battle became a symbol of the decline of chivalry. It showed that heavy cavalry alone was no longer a decisive force on the battlefield when opposed by competent strategy, coordinated forces, and well-trained infantry. The tragedy at Nicopolis dampened the enthusiasm of European monarchs for decades and was one of the reasons why Constantinople eventually fell. What other great battles of the past that changed the course of history and became a lesson for entire generations would you like us to look at? Perhaps you are interested in the Battle of Agincourt, where English archers taught the French a new lesson, or the fall of Constantinople? Suggest your topics in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next episodes.